The American War for Independence produced some fascinating stories involving fascinating people, but not until the 20th century has one of its best stories been investigated properly. It's the story of a very unlikely friendship, a friendship that was a bridge between the Great Awakening and the American Revolution, that despite surface appearances developed and endured through difficult times. It is claimed by some to be the friendship that invented America. It's the story of a famous statesman and a renowned evangelist, Benjamin Franklin and George Whitefield. Born on two different continents, this alone might appear to rule out any kind of friendship between the two men, but there were other differences as well. While both men became transatlantic sensations, their public communication styles were very different. Whitefield's force of personality, booming voice, and unparalleled oratory skills made him a master of public speaking. Franklin, while he was not afraid to address a large group, usually spoke to small groups and found his most effective way of communication through his pen. George was an Oxford graduate, and Ben a grammar school dropout. George was an Englishman who loved America, and Ben was an American who loved England. Ben had a reputation for loving the ladies, while George, on the other hand, seemed almost disinterested in his own wife. But the biggest difference was the one that made this friendship the most unlikely. How could Benjamin Franklin, the archetypical rational deist, and George Whitefield, the archetypical evangelical Christian, ever find common ground, let alone enough common ground to build a friendship? Maybe they had more in common than first meets the eye. Both of these men attempted to create a public persona by leaving a carefully scripted record of their life, Whitefield in his journals and Franklin in his autobiography. If we look to these two primary sources alone, we see the men they wanted the public to see. However, correspondence between the two of them survives, and in taking a closer look at these letters, we unveil a deeper, more intimate look at both of them. While Whitefield's journals do not mention Benjamin Franklin by name, most historians agree that an entry dated Tuesday, November 27, 1739, which reads, "One of the printers has told me he has taken about 200 subscriptions for printing my sermons and journals," is in fact a reference to Benjamin Franklin. Franklin's famed autobiography devotes several pages to the famous evangelist, but his statement that theirs was a mere civil friendship has misled many a historian to assume that Franklin was saying that the relationship between them was nothing much beyond a business partnership. However, an honest evaluation of the Franklin-Whitefield correspondence, largely ignored by many historians until the later part of the 20th century, gives us a more accurate picture into this uncommon friendship. But let's back up a bit and start from the beginning. The older of the two friends, Ben was born in Boston in 1706, the youngest son, actually the 10th son, of Josiah and Abiah Franklin. Though excelling in grammar school, Ben was forced to drop out due to the fact that there were not funds to further his education, and was set up in a printing apprenticeship to his brother James. It was there that Ben discovered and perfected his talent for writing, a talent that would help him to fame and fortune. Unfortunately, due to poor choices in friends and the envy of others, the story of Ben's youth involves a string of disappointments and betrayals, which left him feeling used by others. These lessons in the school of experience contributed to his skepticism of the motives of others, resulting in a plethora of surface relationships, but very few, if any, soulmates. Although raised in the church, Franklin began to question the authenticity of the faith in his teens. For a while, he turned to deism, but when that did not produce the fruit of goodness that Franklin expected from a religion, he set out to craft his own. Franklin came to believe in an almighty God who ruled the universe and was concerned in the affairs of men. He also believed in an afterlife with both rewards and punishments for deeds done during one's lifetime. But he could not come to terms with the divinity of Jesus. He admired Jesus as a teacher and as a man, even going so far as to note that one should imitate Jesus and Socrates, but there he left it. His driving concern was for the betterment of mankind, specifically in creating a better society. His personal drive for self-improvement became the creed of his self-made religion, and he embraced anything that seemed to aid in bringing about that better society. On the other side of the ocean, just 8 years after Ben was born, George entered the world on December 16, 1714. Born to an innkeeper's family in Bristol, England, his father passed away when George was only 2 years old, leaving his widowed mother to keep the inn and take care of her 7 children, of which George was the youngest. As with Ben, George was forced to leave school due to financial constraints, but actually was able to attend Oxford later as a servitor, a student who, while taking classes and earning a degree, worked as a servant for wealthy students in order to pay for his tuition. It was at Oxford that George truly experienced conversion, which came about through the loan of some life-changing books from his friend Charles Wesley, and an illness followed by an experience of which he wrote, "But oh, with what joy! Joy unspeakable, even joy that was full of and big with glory, was my soul filled, when the weight of sin went off, and an abiding sense of the pardoning love of God and of a full assurance of faith broke in upon my disconsolate soul, a day to be had in everlasting remembrance. Whitefield's conversion resulted in a call to preach, and he felt a specific calling to the new colony of Georgia when entreated by his friends John and Charles Wesley to join them in their missionary endeavors there. Ironically, the Wesleys' missionary experience was nothing short of disaster, but George's newfound faith was rooted in his experience, and he was undeterred. It took a year of waiting as Governor Oglethorpe of Georgia kept rescheduling his departure for the colonies, which meant that George had to wait for his departure as well. During that year, George accepted invitation after invitation to preach, and his renown as an evangelist began to grow. His exceptional abilities as an orator were not only his booming voice, which he had learned to project in his theater experiences in his early school years, but his dramatic delivery, which pierced to the heart of the matter, no doubt fueled by his personal experience and conviction that conversion was a matter of the heart as well as the head. His preaching, sincere but with dramatic flair, attracted crowds increasingly larger the more he preached. He was news before he ever reached the shores of America. Whitefield arrived in Georgia in the spring of 1737. Only 2 weeks into his short 3-month visit there, he conceived an idea that would dominate his thoughts for the rest of his life. Noting the large number of orphans there, he determined to open an orphan house, not just to keep the children off the streets, but to educate and care for them so that they might grow up to be useful members of society. Before they even met, a basis for his friendship with Franklin was being laid. Although the exact time and place of the very first meeting of Ben and George is not recorded, we do know that they met sometime in November of 1739, presumably on publishing business, when Whitefield began his second preaching tour in America. For the next 12 months, on a weekly basis, Franklin published something about Whitefield's American preaching tour. It was only natural that the two should meet and correspond. Franklin owned the biggest newspaper in Philadelphia, and Whitefield, drawing hundreds and quite often thousands when he spoke, was news. Always a skeptic, Franklin doubted the reports that had preceded Whitefield's arrival, claiming that he had preached to 25,000 people in an open field. The ever-curious Franklin quickly formulated a way to test that claim by walking away from Whitefield and testing where he lost the sound of George's voice. A full city block away, he calculated that not 25,000 people, but 30,000 people could stand within earshot of the famous evangelist and still hear his powerful message. In April of 1740, Whitefield told Franklin about his orphan house building project, which he named Bethesda. This may have been the time that a popularly quoted event related by Franklin in his autobiography took place. Here's what happened. Ben decided to attend one of George's evangelistic meetings as he came through Philadelphia. Apprised of the orphan house project, and objecting to its location in Georgia, he heartily supported the project itself, but he felt it would be better to construct it in Philadelphia. Ben went, as he termed, quote, silently resolved he should get nothing from me, end quote. He had in his pockets a handful of copper money, 3 or 4 silver dollars, and 5 pistols in gold. From his own account, he says, as he proceeded, I began to soften, and concluded to give the coppers. Another stroke of his oratory made me ashamed of that, and determined me to give the silver. And he finished so admirably that I emptied my pocket wholly into the collector's dish, gold and all. If this was the effect Whitefield had on Benjamin Franklin, imagine his power over the masses. Even David Garrick, London's greatest actor of the 18th century, lamented, I would give 100 guineas if I could say, oh, like Mr. Whitefield. Although the bulk of their correspondence is lost, what does remain shows us that Whitefield and Franklin most likely met again that November and may have discussed spiritual matters. Just a little over a week after his departure from Philadelphia, Whitefield sent Franklin a letter dated November 26, 1740. It was mostly business, but included a sentence saying that Whitefield desired that they keep in contact, and then something that appears to be referencing a prior conversation. He writes, quote, I do not despair of seeing the reasonableness of Christianity. Apply to God, be willing to do the divine will, and you shall know it. Whitefield was concerned about the state of Franklin's soul. The friendship had somehow gone to a deeper level. One wonders if it was not only his pocketbook that Franklin opened to Whitefield at this time, but perhaps just a tiny slice of his heart. While Franklin published glowing reports of the revivals and Whitefield himself, a backlash of criticism followed, after which Ben published some rather unflattering material about Whitefield. Accused of being pro-revival, Franklin wanted to assert his neutrality in all things religious. Whitefield appears to have been undisturbed by this move from his new friend, but there also appeared to be a cooling off of the friendship, indicated by a silence between the men for about 5 years. The years between saw a maturing of George. There was violence against the reformer and the revivals, and he realized that he needed to mend some fences. Without backing down on fundamental truth, he apologized to clergy for causing division among the churches and reached out to his opponents at Harvard. Late in the summer of 1745, Ben heard from George once again, suggesting the two of them meet up. Ben replied with, "You know my house. If you can make shift with its scanty accommodations, you will be most welcome." Whether Ben felt the time had put enough distance between him and George, or he heard news of a kinder, gentler George, or he simply wanted to mend fences too, Whitefield took him up on the offer, saying that if he made the offer for Christ's sake, Franklin should not miss a reward. Franklin, always honest and ever witty, replied, "Don't let me be mistaken. It was not for Christ's sake, but for your sake." They understood each other. With this reconnection came a deepening of their friendship. Perhaps part of it was that at last a friend with whom there had been some negative past was pursuing a friendship with Ben despite that. With Whitefield's revival tour still going strong, there was always a plea for funds for the Bethesda House Orphanage and many other charitable causes as well. Funds came pouring in, and along with them whispered speculation that the revivalist might be dipping into the funds for himself. Had anyone actually seen this so-called orphanage way down in the swamps of Georgia? Combating this rumored allegation, Whitefield had audits made and sworn affidavits provided that he had not converted or applied any part of the donations to his own private use and property, neither hath charged the orphan house with any of his traveling or any other private expense whatsoever. Ben promptly reprinted them in the Pennsylvania Gazette and followed it up a few months later, of July 23, 1746, with an editorial piece entitled Appreciation of George Whitefield that had an uncharacteristically emotional element to it. Along with pointing out Whitefield's consistency and extreme labors despite a declining constitution, he stated, quote, "We may reasonably think with the learned Dr. Watts that he is a man raised up by Providence in an uncommon way to awaken a stupid and ungodly world to a sense of the important affairs of religion and eternity." Ben Franklin had come to his friend's rescue. In the summer of 1747, it appears Whitefield stayed with the Franklins for a while. A letter dated August 6, 1747, records Franklin's reply to his brother John's news that Whitefield had made it to Boston. Ben wrote, "I'm glad to hear that Mr. Whitefield is safe arrived and recovered his health. He is a good man, and I love him." The next few years see correspondence that ran not just between Ben and George, but amongst Ben's family members as well, with Franklin passing along a note from Whitefield to his sister Jane, and also thanking George for some gifts. The letters show the two friends exchanging ideas, books, good wishes, and greetings to other family members or friends, and from time to time George would inquire about Ben's spiritual state. When Franklin's fame grew as a scientist, Whitefield wrote a letter dated August 17, 1752, congratulating him on his achievements, but could not miss a chance to recommend to his good friend that he spend some time studying the mystery of the new birth. He added, quote, "You will excuse this freedom. I must have something of Christ in all my letters," end quote. And Ben understood. Perhaps the most telling letter, revealing the sincere affection the two men had for one another, was written by Franklin and dated July 2, 1756. Quote, "I sometimes wish that you and I were jointly employed by the Crown to settle a colony on the Ohio. I imagine we could do it effectually, and without putting the nation to much expense. But I fear we shall never be called on for such a service. What a glorious thing it would be to settle in that fine country a large, strong body of religious and industrious people. What a security to the other colonies, an advantage to Britain, by increasing her people, territory, strength, and commerce. Might it not greatly facilitate the introduction of pure religion among the heathen, if we could, by such a colony, show them a better sample of Christianity than they commonly see in our Indian traders?" In this letter, Franklin reveals several things. First, Whitefield is someone who he could not only work with, but live with. He recognizes that they made a great team and names their strengths. Most telling of all, he sees in Whitefield the fruit of pure religion, unlike so many around him who name the name of Christ without any evidence of his work in their lives. As historian Harry Stout put it, quote, "There were too many who talked the new birth, but lived the old lies," end quote. Franklin found in Whitefield a person he could trust because Whitefield was authentically Christ-like. During 1756 to 69, both Ben and George were in England, so there are not letters for this time period between the two men. But on February 27, 1766, Ben wrote to his wife Deborah, "Mr. Whitefield called today," evidence that the two men were spending time together. Even more importantly, on February 13, 1766, Franklin appeared before Parliament to testify against the Stamp Act. Whitefield was present for the proceedings. While the Stamp Act was repealed, on the heels of it came the Declaratory Acts, which gave Parliament even wider berth to control the colonies. There were those who felt that Franklin was responsible for this new measure by differentiating between internal and external taxes when he testified against the Stamp Act, and blamed him for betraying the colonies. It was Whitefield's turn to come to the defense of his friend. That March of 1766, Whitefield wrote a letter to his network of supporters praising Franklin's parliamentary testimony, and the word was quickly disseminated on Franklin's behalf, clearing him of the unfair charge. Both men were back in America in 1769. Whitefield's health had been slowly deteriorating, and it was not good when he arrived, but he wanted to make one more American tour. He visited his beloved Bethesda for the last time in 1769, and then, after a 4-month rest, made his way to Philadelphia, preaching his way up to New England and losing energy as he went. He died at the manse in Newburyport, Massachusetts, on Sunday morning, September 30, 1770. Not only was one of Anglo-America's first celebrities gone, but an incredible friendship of 30 years had come to a close. In a letter to a friend in the Georgia legislature, Franklin stated, "I knew him intimately upwards of 30 years. His integrity, disinterestedness, and indefatigable zeal in prosecuting every good work I have never seen equaled. I shall never see exceeded." So what made this friendship work? The similarities are much more than what it appears at first glance. Both Ben and George were youngest sons who were sent to school but had to help out with the family business, learning the value of hard work in the process. Both, because they each left detailed accounts of their youth, show us young men attempting to construct and revise their own image, becoming masters of that, each in their own way, coming to understand the power of image, not just for their own use, but as a tool to shape culture and change society. Both were men who rose in the ranks but were never completely accepted by the gentry of colonial society. They were the colonial celebrities, and as such would have understood each other as no one else could, giving them a unique opportunity for authenticity with each other. Neither man cared for the rigid sectarianism of the established church, so, as Randy Peterson states in his book, The Printer and the Preacher, quote, "When Whitefield, with Franklin's support, broke down these denominational walls, he was clearing the way for the invention of America," end quote. The spark that made the friendship possible is when Franklin realized that George's agenda wasn't all that different from his own. The religion that Whitefield promoted produced a highly beneficial effect on the society in Pennsylvania, and Ben's heart was for the improvement of society. This unlikely friendship thrived because these men respected each other enough to provide room for their theological differences. They truly communicated, both sharing their thoughts and sincerely listening to one another. They both had commitment to character and the development of it, not just in themselves, but in the society at large. They knew the meaning of loyalty and gave each other that gift. And at the risk of sounding trite, they valued love, expressed in caring for others, especially the underserved of their society. As historian Douglas Southwell Freeman aptly observed, their friendship was a living example of iron sharpening iron.